Chapter 25, Ship. Ruby walked into the town, unseeing and unfeeling. She didn't know where to go, she didn't know what to do. Her hood shadowed her face as she shuffled around, passing people in shops and nightclubs. How did Max and Lily ask her to contact them again? A tablet. An address. Ruby's sure they were living their lives happily now, maybe as hunters, or maybe just having a normal life, settling down in a city and adopting children and taking normal jobs. They didn't need the chaos she brought with her, they didn't need her emotions. They didn't need her urge to kill every single person she passed by on the street. She walked into an alley and sat down, setting her bag down next to her. She needed to think. She vaguely remembered someone trying to mug her, but now he was lying on the ground next to her, bubbling sounds coming out of his torn throat as his entrails steamed in the night air. She ripped out his liver. The man stopped breathing. Ruby stood up a while later, the moon high in the sky. She would take up Everest's offer. She had nothing else, after all. Eating the last scrap of liver, she wiped her hands on the towel she took from her bag and stood up. Stripping off her sweatpants, she swapped on a pair of jeans. She ripped off a strip of her ruined sweatpants, tying the fabric around her face, then pushed her hair back into her hood, covering her head. She first stopped at a shop where tablets were on display. Looking around and making sure that the store's employees weren't paying attention, she plugged the plastic strip into a tablet, opening up the single file that was on it. A digital map opened up, displaying a large region of vital. A dot was over a continent, so she tapped on it, a bubble popping up and coordinates displaying. The location of the dot indicated that the outpost was in the Dragon Wings. Ruby realized that this was the place they had been planning to send her after her stay at road camp was over. Then they had rescinded that decision. Well, too bad, she thought, I'm going to go anyways. She unplugged the strip of plastic, putting it back into her pocket, then selected a GPS-enabled, solar-powered tablet and brought it to the checkout. The bored teenager at the register didn't even glance at her as he swiped her lean and gave it back to her, placed the tablet in a white shopping bag, then went back to staring at his own tablet. She left the shop and walked back to the general store she'd passed earlier, intent on picking up some supplies. She pushed open the door, the bells jingling, and entered the shop. The cashier stared at her, and Ruby realized that her mask probably looked a little suspicious, especially at this hour. She tried to give him a smile, her lips moving underneath the cloth and her face crinkling upwards, and the cashier relaxed a bit, still keeping an eye on her. Ruby placed the straps of her bag around her shoulder and walked down the aisles, spending an hour looking for traveling supplies, thinking back in her camping trips with Yang. She grabbed a few rolls of steel silk, a fire-starting kit, extra fabric, vitamin supplements, which she doubted she would need but just in case, a sewing kit, a sleeping bag, canteens, extra dust for her tablet in case there wasn't any sunlight, and a physical map of the region with a compass as backup. Her arms overburdened, things dropping every other step, she also picked up a large backpack and stuffed everything inside. The cashier raised an eyebrow as Ruby placed her things on the counter, the large backpack nearly obscuring her view of the register. Ruby took out her lean, handing it to him. The steel silk was a little expensive but Ruby had inheritance money to burn, and she didn't really need to buy anything else anyways. The cashier frowned a little at the odd list of things she was buying, but since Ruby wasn't purchasing alcohol or weapons, he just shrugged and swiped her card. Ruby mumbled a thank you and walked outside, taking a few minutes to organize her things and wear her backpack and travel bag comfortably. Pulling out her tablet, she slid the plastic strip back in and checked the map. She was on the edge of the residential district, still close to Beacon, and also pretty close to the docks. Zooming in as much as possible, she got a general sense of her location and began walking towards the docks, hoping to make it there before the early morning ships left. Street lamps lit the sidewalk as Ruby walked, the traffic on the roads nearly non-existent at this time of the night. Thoughts of alleys and Beacon and family came to her head, unbidden, but Ruby shoved them down and walled them up, slowly beginning to seal away her emotions of pain and bloodlust. Walking mindlessly, too numb to be exhausted, Ruby moved forward, silently, a large burden upon her back. The sky had just started to fade to a light shade of blue as Ruby arrived. The docks were huge, hundreds of boats of all shapes and sizes and colors along the piers. Some of the boats were transport ships, going to and from other continents. Others were tourist ships, docked early in the morning and waiting for the passengers. Ruby walked down the docks, glancing at each signpost on the piers that stated where and when the ship was going. After an hour of trudging up and down the docks, the only ship she could find was a transport ship going to the tip of the lowest peninsula of the Dragon Wing. Ruby pulled out her tablet and looked at her map again. The outpost was also located along the shore, but was further down the continent. The tip was an active tourist spot, but the cruise trips were slow and Ruby didn't have the patience to wait for one of them to come back from a trip. The cruise ships might also ask her for an ID, which Ruby couldn't give due to her fugitive status. She hoped that the transport ship wouldn't have heard any news about her yet. The docks were still mostly deserted as she walked down the pier, the only people active being the sailors as they moored or undocked the ships. She hesitated upon reaching the docking platform, unsure whether to board or to wait at the pier and hope that someone came. The ship was a huge cargo ship, piled high with large shipping containers. The ship itself was close to the water and had a black and red hull. The decision was made for her when a young man appeared at the side of the freighter, his soft black ringlets of hair framing his lightly freckled and tanned skin. "Hey," he said, "what are you standing around here for?" "I was wondering if I could get a ride," Ruby said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not really comfortable around people on tourist boats, so I was wondering if I could get a ride on your ship," she said half truthfully. "I have money, so I can probably pay your asking price." The young man stood there, the appearance of the mysterious girl with gray eyes intriguing him. She had a hood on her head, half her face obscured with a piece of fabric. Her small frame was dwarfed back the backpack on her bag, the weak morning light making her seem frail and in need. His heart stirred. "It's not actually my ship," he said, "but I can bring you on board to talk with my father. Would that be all right?" Ruby nodded, not looking directly at him. "Come on up," he said. "Do you need any help?" Ruby shook her head and began walking up the boarding platform, following him as he walked alongside her. "My name's Derek," he said. "Nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too." He paused for a bit, his feet still walking but unsure of what to say next. He didn't want to pry too much, but this girl wasn't really talkative. "So," he began, searching for words, "I'm here with my dad, to get experience. He owns this ship and a shipping company." Ruby finally spoke up. "How long have you been out at sea?" A bit surprised, Derek answered. "It's been nearly 2 years, we've been traveling around the continents and we just stopped at Vale to drop off some cargo. After we go to the Dragon Wings, we'll go too." Ruby tuned out the rest of his words as he continued to talk, feeling a bit hopeful that they hadn't heard about her yet. The ship's interior was decently large, Ruby passing through hallways that led to the library, reading rooms, dining halls, crew cabins, and the gym. The ship was modern, with white lights lighting up the interior and metal surfaces gleaming. Turning down one last hallway, they arrived at a metal door that simply said, "Captain." Derek knocked twice and opened the door. The office was big, a large wooden desk set in the middle of the room, bookshelves surrounding it on 3 sides. A weathered man sat at the desk, his salt and pepper hair and beard showing his age. He looked up, glancing at his son and then staring at Ruby. "Hello there, young lady," he said, standing up. "What do you need?" "I brought her here because she said she wanted a ride," Derek said. "She said she could pay for it." He glanced at his father, pleading with his eyes. The captain looked at Ruby, her face mask, hood, and backpack making an odd appearance. "Do you mind taking off your hood?" he asked. "I can't tell what you look like." Ruby took a breath, realizing that this would make or break the success of this idea. She slowly pulled down her hood, her black and red hair slipping out, cursing herself for not dyeing her hair. She slipped her face mask off too, to avoid them getting suspicious. Derek's eyes were glued to her face as he realized that her hood and mask weren't hiding any physical abnormalities. The captain nodded, seeing Ruby as just another girl to his eyes. "Well, I see no problem with accepting another passenger, as long as you can pay for the trip. A lot of people travel by freight, and we've got 2 other passengers on board, so you'll have some company." Ruby smiled, relieved, and Derek's heart thumped a little harder. Do you have a name? He asked. I'll need to write you down in the register. Red, Ruby said without hesitation. Red. Scarlet. The captain chuckled. What a name you have there, Red. He nodded to his son. I'll have Derek here get you settled in your room. You can get food at the dining hall in the morning, at lunch, and at dinner. We leave the port in 2 days. See you around, Red. Derek left the room and Ruby followed, shutting the door behind them. He led her down another hallway and into the guest suite section, a hallway with 12 doors, 2 of them having "occupied" signs on them. Derek stopped at the third one down the hallway and fished out a key ring, selecting the right one and opening the door. The room was the size of a hotel room, with a bathroom section and a general section that included 2 beds, a cabinet between them and a set of curtains above them. Derek opened up the curtains, tying them to the sides and letting the morning light in. Here's your room, he said. If you need anything, you can just walk around and find someone to ask. Thanks, Ruby said. Do you know where I can wash my clothes? We have laundry days, once every week. If you need to wash your clothes immediately, just walk around a bit. The laundry room should be pretty easy to find. The hallways on this ship are circular, so if you keep walking you'll eventually get somewhere. Alright, Ruby said. She slid open the closet, taking off her backpack and stuffing it inside. Opening up her travel bag, she began taking out her clothes and stacking them on the shelves. Derek was still in the room, waiting for something. So, were you going to do anything today? He asked. We only dock once in a while, so I usually take this time to go into town and have some fun. You wanna come? Ruby declined, knowing that she would surely be recognized if she went out into the residential district of Vale. Derek looked a little disappointed, but nodded and left, shutting the door. She finished placing her clothes into the closet, leaving her weapon in the backpack. Ruby sighed a bit, already bored, as she sat on the bed and flopped down, staring at the ceiling. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out the tablet and began playing with it. After wasting an hour reading the news and fiddling around on some games, she got up, trying to find something productive to do. Opening the door and walking down the hallway, she knocked on the first occupied door she saw, wondering if anyone was inside. A few seconds later, a girl with glasses and a ponytail opened the door. Taller than her and well-proportioned, she had dark brown hair and nearly black eyes, a bored expression on her face as she continued speaking into the tablet. Yes, alright mom. Yes, I'm keeping up with my studies. No, I'm not wasting time. Yes, I'm video conferencing my tutor every day. She motioned for Ruby to sit onto the bed as she argued with her mother. Yes, taking a freighter was a good decision. It's so much less crowded than an airship and it's a lot cheaper. We'll arrive in another few weeks. Alright, yes, okay, alright bye. She flicked her fingers across the tablet, silencing the other end. Hey, she said, addressing Ruby. Do you need help with something? Ruby looked around the room, the walls bare and nondescript, the only sign of residence being a pile of textbooks and sheets of paper stacked neatly on the desk, a lamp next to them. Sorry, I got a little bored, Ruby admitted. I'm just walking around and talking to the other passengers. Yeah, I'm bored too, she said, setting her tablet down on the table and closing her textbooks. Let's go grab some breakfast, it's almost 8. They set out down the hallway, chatting as they circled the ship. Ruby learned that her name was Jessica, and that she was traveling abroad to study. She hated air traveling, having moved around way too much, so she managed to save up enough money to travel on a freighter. The dining hall was already filled with a few crew members when they arrived, the food being served buffet style. The two got plates and took a few pancakes, Ruby drizzling hers with syrup and canned strawberries. She grabbed a cup of milk, with Jessica getting coffee, and sat down at an empty table. So, enough about me. What do you do? Jessica asked, spearing a pancake. Ruby froze, her milk halfway to her mouth. Jessica looked at her and shook her head. That's fine, you don't need to say anything. I just like to talk a lot, that's all. Ruby still felt a little bad, so she ventured a scrap of information. Well, I used to go to Beacon, she said. I'm taking an indefinite leave right now. Whoa, Jessica said, eyes suddenly gleaming. So you can fight and stuff. She made hacking motions with her arms. Beating back Grim and saving humanity and all. Ruby smiled, Jessica's enthusiasm a little contagious. I guess so, Ruby said, but I'm nowhere near being a hunter yet. I still have a lot of years of schooling left, and I don't have that much battle experience. Jessica was unfazed. But you can still fight, right? Do you think you could teach me something? I find hunters so cool, she said, drawing out the last word. Why don't you just go train to become a hunter? Ruby asked. You never know what might happen, maybe you'd be great at it. Jessica frowned a bit. My family focuses a lot of academics, she explained. They want me to get a good education and become something respectable, like a doctor or lawyer. And besides, I'm a little too old now. They continued eating, Jessica explaining what she was learning as they finished their pancakes off. Midway through, the other passenger joined them. Hey, Jessica said. Just woke up. The new arrival ran a hand through his tawny gold hair, yawning. He opened his emerald green eyes, blinking sleepily. Trying to speak, he caught another yawn, his hand coming up and trying to stifle it. That's Mark, Jessica laughed. He's a sleepyhead. Whoa, Mark protested. I'm just not a morning person, don't discriminate. I don't understand how you're not even tired. Jessica took a sip of her coffee as an answer. This is Red, Jessica said, introducing her. She just got on. Hi, Mark, Ruby said. What do you do around here? I just sit in the library all day, Mark answered. It gets pretty boring sometimes, glad to have you around. Jessica slapped his shoulder. Mark, stop being so humble. Turning to Ruby, she explained. He actually spends all of his day drawing in the library. You should see some of his drawings, they're incredible. He keeps saying that he isn't an artist, but I completely disagree. Mark looked a little abashed, grinning a bit. I can draw you, if you'd like. That would be cool, Ruby said. I'd love to watch you draw. Mark nodded and yawned again. I think I'm going to go take a nap, he said, getting up. I might be in the library during the afternoon. See you later, Red, Jessica. Turning around, he stumbled off towards the exit, nearly colliding with one of the crew members. And I thought he was getting up early for once, Jessica muttered. She held her wrist up, glancing at the watch. Dang, time passes fast. I have to go start my lessons now. Sorry, Red, we can totally meet up for lunch. How does 12 sound? Sounds good to me, Ruby responded, picking up her empty plate. See you then. Jessica smiled and also picked up her plate, setting it down on the counter and striding quickly back towards her room. Ruby left her plate at the designated area and began walking around the hallways, searching for something to do. Chapter 26, Settling In. Ruby walked around the hallways, greeting the few passing sailors with a smile and a nod. They usually smiled back, although one of them looked at her strangely. Most of the sailors were out taking advantage of the shore leave, so Ruby had yet to meet them all. After taking in the entire ship and noting where all the places were, she walked back to her room to change her clothes. She had found a gym, so she decided that she would continue taking care of herself and training, just as Max and Lily would have wanted her to do. Stripping off her sweatshirt, t-shirt, jeans, and shorts, she walked into the bathroom, looking at herself in the mirror. Her previous unmarred skin was marked again. There was a scar between her breasts, a vertical ridge right over her belly button, a mark on her shoulder blade, and 2 raised edges in her thigh. She sighed and turned away, going to her closet and grabbing a pair of black shorts and a tank top, putting them on. She picked up the keys on the bedside table and left her room, locking the door. Quickly going through a routine of stretches, she limbered herself and jogged down the hallway, heading for the gym. Only a few people were inside, most of them with earbuds or headphones on. Ruby wished she had bought a pair of headphones in town, but she didn't want to risk it now. Using a tiny bit of her natural aura, careful not to flare it, she loaded on a few hundred pounds for each exercise and went through squats, deadlifts, bench presses, shoulder presses, and so forth. A few people stared at her, but after seeing the tiny edge of aura around her they realized she was an aura user and moved on. Once done with her strength-building exercises, she ran on the treadmill, watching the clock. At 11:30, she stepped off of the treadmill and headed back to her room. Stripping off her clothes, she took a quick shower, then dressed in track pants and a t-shirt and went to go meet Jessica for lunch. The food was once again served buffet style, the dining hall having an excellent selection of dishes. The food gets good when we dock, Jessica mumbled through a mouthful. Enjoy it while you can, they won't have the supplies to cook like this when we're out at sea. Ruby nodded, also engrossed in the delicious food. A few minutes of silent munching later, Jessica suddenly spoke. Teach me, Red, she said. I want to learn how to fight, how to defend myself. Ruby nodded. Sure, she said. When do you have time? Well, my tutoring ends at around 3, so maybe then. Okay, Ruby said. The first thing you should do is go work out, use the gym. Jessica paused. What? If you want to defend yourself, the best way to do so is through the activation of your aura, Ruby explained. Auras usually only activate through talent, training, or willpower. Even if your aura is weak, your training will do a lot to help you learn how to fight and defend yourself. If you don't have the strength and speed, I can't really teach you anything. That sounds like an awful lot of time and effort, Jessica said. Can't you teach me a few fighting moves? No, Ruby said. And that doesn't even make sense. The most I could teach you would be the things you would learn in a standard self-defense class. Well, how did you get strong? Jessica asked. I trained from a really young age, Ruby said. I was inspired by someone close to me to become a huntress, so I trained long and hard. My uncle, Hiro, taught me how to fight, and through a combination of both these things I managed to activate my aura. Wow, Jessica said. Alright, I'll go work out. Will you come help me? I haven't done anything like that before. Jessica felt a little odd, asking someone as young as Ruby for help, but she recognized Ruby's experience. Ruby smiled. Sure. I won't go easy on you, promise. Something about working out? Mark asked, sitting down next to them. Jessica nodded. Ruby's going to train me how to fight, and she said the first step will be hitting the weight room. Sounds good, Mark said, stuffing a piece of pork into his mouth. Ruby, I'll be in the library after lunch. Wanna come? Yup, Ruby said. Is the library any good? Yeah, there's a lot of good books, and anything you can't find you can usually download onto tablets. Continuing their chatter, they finished up their lunches, Jessica heading back to her room while Mark led Ruby to the library. Unlike the other rooms, the library had a set of double doors, thick and wooden. The doors swung open to reveal a large space, much unlike the cramped room Ruby had been expecting. The library was situated on the side of the ship, so one side of the wall was lined with large windows, each revealing the docks and shoreline of the residential district. The room was carpeted, comfortable chairs and little tables scattered throughout it. On the sides of the room were shelves of books, each one a wooden glass cabinet that was illuminated by an overhead light. The library overall was bright and well lit, the sunlight entering the windows and scattering off the glass surfaces. Mark headed off to one of the windows and Ruby followed him, noticing a large sheet of paper laid out on the desk next to it. Mark pulled a chair over and set it down next to the chair already there, sitting down and grabbing a charcoal pencil. Ruby sat down next to him, looking over what he was painting. The paper spanned the desk, an outline of the docks already beginning to take place as Mark looked out the windows and sketched, the charcoal flying across the page. Wow, Ruby breathed. How are you drawing so quickly? Practice, Mark said, glancing out the window and then resuming his sketching. I do one of these every time we dock. The rest are in my room as wall decorations. Ruby watched for another half hour as the docks took shape and he began painting, peppering Mark with questions about all the places he had been to, where he had come from, and where he was going. He said he wasn't sure yet, and that he was traveling the world for fun. He had just graduated with an art degree, so he wanted to take the time to see the world before settling down. It was 1:30 when he set down his brushes and looked at her. Sorry for ignoring you, I just get really focused sometimes, he apologized. Ruby placed her palms out in front of her, shaking her head. No, that was really cool. It was fun watching you create something. Mark smiled at her, his golden hair glinting in the sunlight and his emerald eyes gleaming. I can draw you now, if you'd like. He paused for a second, looking her up and down, humming. This might sound a bit weird, he began, but... Yes. His cheeks flushed a little. Do you want to do some nude modeling? Completely for artistic purposes, I swear. It'll be interesting. Ruby was a little taken back. Me. There's something about you, Mark said, interested. Something I don't really see in many humans. I mean, people in general. Your exterior is appealing, of course, but there's something inside of you. He trailed off. Ruby said, thinking. Okay, I guess. I'll just sit somewhere and you'll paint me, right? Great, Mark exclaimed, clapping his hands. Does your room have a window? Yes. Alright, let's do it there then. Ruby stood up. Mark grabbed his brushes, pencils, canvas, and stand, following her to her room. Upon arriving, Mark looked a little awkward. I'll stay outside while you... Ruby interrupted him. It's fine, she said, opening the door and stripping off her clothes quickly. She jumped onto the bed, bouncing. So, what do I do? She asked with a grin. Just lie down on the bed. Sprawl, seem a little lazy. Ruby stilled herself and lay down on the bed, repositioning her limbs. That's great, just hold still, Mark said, quickly setting down his stand. He placed his tools on the desk and set up the canvas, looking Ruby over. Ruby's injuries stood out a bit, the raised edges visible in the sunlight. I don't mean to sound nosy, but how did you get those scars? He asked, beginning to quickly sketch her outline. I fought a lot of people, Ruby said quietly. Nodding, Mark didn't ask any more questions as he continued to draw. Mark squinted a bit. That came out a little odd. Ruby looked at her picture. She was lounging on the bed, sun shining through the windows and the sunlight illuminating her pale skin. Her hair looked more black than red, and each of the imperfections in her skin was perfectly captured. Her pose looked a little relaxed and a little predatory, but the odd thing was the somehow sad expression on her face. Sorry, Mark said, reaching for the picture. I don't know why you look so depressed. Let me try Aga. No, Ruby said, snatching up the picture. This is perfect. Thank you. Mark was a little confused, but smiled a bit. No problem, Red. You were a really fascinating subject. Ruby suddenly thought of something. Wait, what time is it? Mark looked up. The clock says 3:08. Oh crud, Ruby said, frantically putting her clothes back on. I said I would meet Jessica at 3. Have fun, Mark said, gathering up his supplies. Ruby dashed out of the room, tugging her t-shirt down. Jessica's room was right next to hers, so she adjusted herself and knocked on the door. Coming, came a shout from the inside. The door opened and Jessica stood in the doorway, dressed in a pair of workout shorts and a tank top that accentuated her chest. Ruby couldn't stop herself from ogling a bit before looking up into Jessica's face. Her hair was tied back in a ponytail and her glasses were still on, a nervous expression on her face. Is this fine? She asked. Is it okay if I wear glasses? I don't really like wearing contacts, they irritate my eyes. Ruby nodded. You're okay, she said. Let's go. Ruby spent the rest of the afternoon demonstrating what to do in the weight room and teaching Jessica what she could do by herself in between tutoring sessions. 3 hours later, Jessica stood there, sweating, muscles trembling, hands in her knees as she got off the treadmill. Red, she wheezed. Do I have to do this every day? Ruby smiled a bit, nodding. You'll get used to it, promise, and it might even start to feel good after a while. I don't feel too good right now. Jessica gave up on standing and lay down on the floor, panting. Come on, Ruby said, extending a hand. Let's go get some food. You'll need to eat more, too, if you want to keep up. Shower first, Jessica said, grasping her hand. Can't let Mark see me like this. They walked back to Jessica's room, Ruby supporting her on her shoulder for a bit before she could walk on her own. Ruby wasn't tired, having spent most of the time teaching Jessica, so she waited for Jessica as she stepped into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Jessica let out little sighs of pleasure as the hot water hit her exhausted muscles, and Ruby had to restrain herself from ripping open the door and joining her. Instead, she tried to take a nap on the bed, suppressing her desires and trying to think calming thoughts. Ruby had dozed off, the sound of the bathroom door opening waking her up. She peeked with one eye, pretending to be asleep, as Jessica walked out of the bathroom in a thin towel, the strands of her dark brown hair reaching halfway down her back in dripping water. She let the towel slip as she opened up her closet and rummaged through, forcing Ruby to clench her hands against the bed, leaving indents, as Jessica dressed, squeezing her eyes closed and once again trying to think peaceful thoughts. "Red, wake up," Jessica sang, not noticing the tension in Ruby's body. "Let's go." Ruby opened her eyes, seeing Jessica wearing a white dress shirt and jeans, hair still a little wet. "We're not going to shore, are we?" Ruby asked. Jessica laughed a little, shaking her head. "I'm usually quite nervous around people, so definitely not, no. We'll just eat in the dining hall, they'll probably have something good to eat." The dining hall was full of people when they arrived, the crew members returning from their shore leave for a meal. The cooks had made steaks and seafood, with side dishes of all sorts of vegetables and desserts. "I don't think sailors usually come back to the boat to eat," Jessica said, "but they told me that last year the captain hired a few dedicated cooks. A lot of sailors signed up after that, so it was worthwhile in the end." As they brought their food back to the tables, Ruby took a good glance at the crew members. There were about 30 in the dining hall, and a good portion of them were women. She saw a few faunus talking with the crew members and interacting with them normally. Jessica saw her looking at them. "Yeah, I've noticed that everyone gets along pretty well on this ship. They're going to be out at sea for long journeys, so it would make sense for them to be able to work together." "What's your opinion on the faunus?" Ruby asked, curious. Jessica sat down at an empty table and Ruby followed suit. "Where I come from, there aren't many faunus," Jessica explained. "So I don't really have an opinion about them. I'd have to say though, some of their little ears are really cute." Ruby grinned. "I completely agree," she said, biting into her steak. "Does Mark usually come down for dinner?" "Sometimes," Jessica said, shrugging. "Other times, I think he forgets to eat while he's drawing. Or he might just be asleep." A while later, Ruby noticed that some of the sailors had pulled out cards and gathered in at a table, playing poker. "Want to join them?" Ruby asked. "There isn't really anything to do right now." Jessica shook her head. "You can go if you want, Red, but like I said, I'm not really a people person." "That's okay," Ruby said. "Are we allowed to go above decks?" "You can't be in the cargo area, because it's too dangerous, but there is a small section we can go to. It's raised into the air and you can usually get a good view from up there." "That would be nice," Ruby said. "And then we could go back to your room and play cards by ourselves or something. I have some cool tablet games too, and we could play together," Jessica ventured. "It would be nice to finally have someone to play with. Mark doesn't play tablet games and he's usually gone when we're docked." Plans made, they finished their dinner and walked into the hallway, trying to find the passage that led above deck. They were interrupted when Derek stumbled into them, more than a little drunk. He sprawled onto the floor, unable to get up. "Hey Red," he slurred. "I think I drank a little too much." Ruby and Jessica stared at him. "Do you think I should get the captain?" Ruby asked. "No," Derek exclaimed. "Please don't tell Dad," he mumbled. "He'll be so angry." "He's a big boy, he can take care of himself," Jessica said, frowning in disapproval. "Let's just get him to his room." They pulled him up, half carrying him as they walked him over to his room, following his drunken instructions. His cabin was in the crew hallways, which were deserted, the crew members currently at dinner. Letting him fumble at the door for a minute, Jessica sighed and grabbed the keys from his hand, turning them around and entering them the right way. Ruby went inside first, intent on setting him down on the bed, when Derek suddenly stood up, staggering back to the door and slamming it shut, locking it. "Hey!" Jessica yelled, still on the outside. Derek spun around, suddenly looking a lot less drunk than before. Surprising Ruby, he walked up to her and grabbed her shoulders, pressing her against the wall. "You're so pretty, Red," he said, staring into her eyes. "I want you so much." Ruby could smell the alcohol on his breath. "I think you're a little drunk, Derek. Are you okay in there, Red?" Jessica asked worriedly, her voice muffled by the thick metal door. I'm fine, I can take care of myself. Ruby yelled, ignoring Derek and reassuring Jessica. Get off of me, Derek, or all. He interrupted her with a deep kiss, his tongue probing into her mouth. Ruby was surprised but enjoyed the sensation, the stubble along his jaw scraping into her skin. He began fondling her and slipped a hand down her pants, grabbing her bottom. Something growled inside of Ruby and she broke off his kiss, flustered, pushing him back and dragging him onto his bed. Get a hold of yourself, Derek, she said, slapping him gently. He stared at her in shock, his mouth opening a little as he realized what he had done. Oh God, Red, I'm so sorry, I don't know what came over me, he blurted, tripping over his own words. He tried to get up, but Ruby pushed him back onto the bed. Ruby shook her head. It's all right, Derek, we can talk tomorrow. Just stay out of the hallways and get some rest before someone sees you like this. Derek nodded a little, his eyes still wide as Ruby straightened her clothes and opened the door. Jessica nearly fell inside, having been trying to break in. Are you all right? She asked, looking over Ruby. Did he hurt you? I'm okay, Ruby said, closing the door gently. I think I've had enough excitement for tonight. Let's go back to your room. I don't think I've ever seen him like that before, Jessica said, disturbed. So he doesn't usually come back drunk? Ruby asked as they walked down the hallway. Well, sometimes he drinks when we go to shore, but he's never gotten that drunk. He's the captain's son but he's also a crew member, so I don't talk to him that much. Mark was waiting outside their room when they got back, hands in his pockets. He noticed them arriving and smiled, waving. Red and I were going to play some cards, Jessica said, pulling out a key and unlocking the door. Would you like to join us? Sounds good, Mark said. It gets a little lonely in the library sometimes. They entered the room, sitting down on the bed and Jessica pulling out a pack of cards. Ruby settled in, glad to have made friends. They played late into the night, Ruby eventually falling asleep on one of the beds as the two kept talking. Chapter 27, Attack. Ruby woke up, the sun shining through the open curtains. Jessica was sprawled on the bed next to her, fully clothed, snoring softly, and Mark was gone. The tablet on her desk was beeping a little and vibrating, so Ruby got up and walked over to Jessica, shaking her shoulder. Jessica, I think someone's trying to call you, Ruby said. Jessica's eyes opened immediately. What time is it? She asked frantically, sitting up and straightening out her hair. Ruby glanced at the clock. It's 9. Jessica scrambled off of the bed, reaching for the tablet and swiping it open. Hello, yes, I'm here, she said hurriedly into the tablet. A man in a suit with glasses appeared on the screen, frowning. Jessica, why didn't you pick up? I was sleeping, sorry, Jessica said, grabbing her textbook and spreading it open. I'm ready now. Ruby sneaked out of the room as Jessica began her lessons. Walking down the hallways, she went to go check on Derek. Most of the sailors had gone out during the night and come back late, so only a few were up and about. Ruby tried Derek's door and found it unlocked, so she went in. Derek was in the bathroom in his boxers, shaving, nicking himself when he saw Ruby appear. Red, you can't just come in like that, Derek said, splashing water on his face and washing away the rest of the lather. Sorry, the door was unlocked, Ruby said, standing in the doorway. Derek wiped his face with a towel and sighed. Sorry about last night, Red. That was highly inappropriate of me, especially as the captain's son. That's all right, Ruby said. But do you actually like me? Ah, Derek said, shocked. Yes, I do, but with last night's. Shish, Ruby said, walking up to him and hugging him, his bare chest warm against her. Thanks for getting me onto the ship. If you really like me, we can try it out, see how it goes. Definitely, Derek said, his voice still almost disbelieving. Are you free right now? Not really, Ruby said, tiptoeing and kissing his smooth jaw, wiping away the drop of blood from the small wound and resisting the urge to lick it off of her finger. I need to go work out first, but we can have lunch together. Okay, Derek said. His face was a little red. Ah, I need to go put on some clothes. Ruby chuckled a little at Derek's discomfort and left, shutting the door behind her. Going back to her room, she cleaned herself up and went to the gym. Ruby spent the morning working out, and then had lunch with Jessica, Mark, and Derek, introducing him. Jessica was a little surprised, but Derek talked to them during lunch and apologized again, eventually earning their trust by the end of lunch. Derek showed Ruby around the entire ship that afternoon, walking and talking with her. The three had dinner together, with Mark gone off somewhere again. At night, Derek brought out some board games that he had taken on board with him, the three of them playing together and eventually being joined by Mark. The next morning, the ship left the docks. The captain did a final check to make sure that all the crew members were on board, then collected payment from Ruby. The next few days were spent like this, Ruby falling into a routine to alleviate her boredom. She spent her mornings working out, eating meals with Derek and talking with him, and spent part of her day with Mark and Jessica, reading in the library and training Jessica. She spent the nights with Derek, talking and kissing, but Derek never asked for anything more, which was good because Ruby still didn't know if she could trust herself. It seemed that her days on the ship would be peaceful, a time during which she could relax and recuperate. The captain made one last stop before going into the open stretch of sea between their current location and the lowest tip of the Dragon Wing. They were passing by the tip of another continent, and the captain wanted to resupply and refuel before departing again. A few miles from the coastline, at dawn, the pirates attacked. A fleet of small speedboats bearing the insignia of the White Fang sped towards the cargo ship, the lumbering freighter unable to outrun the nimble motorboats. The three passengers were notified and told to remain below deck as the crew members manned their battle stations. When the pirates got into range, dozens of ports on the side of the boat opened up and began firing, dust explosions slamming into the water. The first shots were just warning shots, but after the pirates began to return fire, the crew started aiming for the little boats. However, when a sinking seemed inevitable, the small boats either barely managed to dodge the blast or the Faunus nimbly leapt off of them and landed onto another nearby boat. The hull collected dense as the pirates relentlessly fired back, the thick windows on the ship cracking a bit under the dust explosions. Soon, the pirates were too close for the dust cannons, only a few of their ships having been taken out. They threw grappling hooks, easily climbing up the ropes and boarding the ship. Each of them wore metal masks, some with hoods, and metal armor, also bearing the White Fang symbol. A few of them ran off into the cargo section, searching out crates and beginning to unfasten them, a hoverjet flying over the plane. The others headed below decks, seeking control of the ship and looking to take hostages. Ruby was peeking out of the window, watching what's going on. The three of them were in Jessica's room, Mark looking a bit frustrated as he sat cross-legged on the bed, and Jessica sitting down in the chair, her back straight and twitching a bit every time she heard an explosion. "Uh-oh, the pirates are boarding," Ruby said. "I see about 50 people climbing on board." "We need to do something," Mark said, suddenly standing on the floor in a blur of movement. "We can't just let the White Fang take what they want." Jessica shook her head, hands visibly shaking. I say we just let them have what want. I don't think our lives are worth some shipping containers." "But what if they're here to steal dust?" Mark asked. "I'm pretty sure I saw some shiny dust containers on the cargo deck. If they take it, they'll use it for even more destruction. And besides, they hate humans. Why would they let our crew live?" "Well, we do have a few Faunus," Ruby said, thinking. "Maybe we could work out a compromise." Mark looked a little angry. "Red, not all Faunus are the same. A lot of them actually oppose the White Fang. In fact, the White Fang are just a minority group that takes the most violent actions that are remembered and reported by the media. They wouldn't be opposed to killing any Faunus that got in their way." There was a large explosion, and the floor shook. Ruby and Mark looked at each other, then ran out of the room, both of them telling Jessica to stay put and to lock the door. The hallway was filled with a light haze of smoke. Ruby looked down the hallway and saw some sailors running towards them, some of them injured and being supported by others. "Run!" one of them shouted. They threw dust bombs down the stairwell. There was another explosion, and the floor shook again, the sailor falling to his knees and then struggling back up. "We'll go into the passenger hallway and seal the entrance," he explained, running past them. Ruby and Mark ran forward, helping the injured sailors move into the passenger section. Once they had all gotten in, one of the sailors reached up and grabbed onto two handles, pulling downwards and slamming a descending hatch shut. The cramped hallway was filled with the sounds of panicked breathing, the crew members temporarily safe. "Is everyone all right?" the captain asked, having made it in there with them. Most of the sailors mumbled an agreement, the most serious injury being a man with a broken leg and arm. However, most of them had minor injuries, having been caught in the edges of the dust explosion. Derek stumbled out of the crowd of soldiers, one arm bloody, running up and hugging Ruby. "Glad you're safe," he mumbled, stroking her hair. Ruby hugged him back. "Are you okay?" she asked, peeling his sleeve back and exposing his forearm. A piece of metal glinted in his skin, and Ruby pulled it out, blood gushing from the wound. Ignoring the sweet, metallic smell, she ripped off the edge of her t-shirt and bound the wound, stemming the blood flow. "Thanks," Derek whispered, and slumped down to the floor, delirious with pain. "Open up," a deep voice suddenly shouted. "Open, or we will open the hatch with force." The captain glanced at the sailors, looking for an opinion. "What are you going to do with us?" he shouted back. "You'll be prisoners," said the voice. "But if you don't open the hatch, you'll all just be dead." Ruby stood up, along with Mark. "I think they're going to kill us anyways," Mark said bluntly. "The White Fang doesn't leave people to talk about them. Does anyone want to fight with us?" A few of the relatively uninjured sailors stood up, nodding, pulling out pistols that had long blades attached. "Can I get one of those?" Ruby asked, pointing at the weapons. Most of the sailors had seen her in the weight room, so they trusted her to know how to fight, tossing her a spare pistol and 2 clips of ammo. Ruby slipped them into her pocket and took the safety off of her gun. And then the doors exploded open, metal shrapnel flying through the room and hitting the crew members. Ruby felt a piece lodge into her side, but she immediately ripped it out, raising her pistol and firing at the Faunus who were swarming into the room. Most of the pirates had some form of sword and gun, some of them dual-wielding. Others had metal pipes that fired dust, and a few had knuckle dusters, wearing metal armbands. Each of Ruby's shots were deflected, a sword or shield coming up and blocking the dust bullets, the Faunus rapidly closing the distance with their superhuman speed. A Faunus with feathers in his hair suddenly slammed into her, his sword coming down towards her head. Ruby barely managed to dodge it, a few strands of hair being cut off, and thrust her blade at him, catching his thigh as he backed up, frowning. Pulling out a dust crystal from his pocket, her threw it at Ruby and fired, the dust igniting in midair and exploding, flinging Ruby back. Disoriented, she watched as the sailors around her went down, the sheer numbers of pirates overpowering them. She slowly got back up, steadying herself with a hand against the wall. Looking around for Mark, she saw him dancing with 2 Faunus, his blade flashing impossibly fast as he parried his attackers, managing to land a few cuts on them. Ruby ran towards them, pivoting and jumping, smashing one of them into the wall with a flying kick. The other Faunus was briefly surprised, and Mark took advantage of that, stabbing him in the arm and smashing a knee into his face, dropping him. And then they were surrounded. The rest of the sailors had already gone down, and the Faunus closed in on the 2, Mark and Ruby standing back to back. They dashed forward, trying to break through the line, but the pirates were disciplined, firing the moment they approached. Ruby felt her aura weaken greatly as the dozens of dust bullets slammed into her, but she pressed on, slashing at the nearest pirate with her blade. The Faunus deflected it and slammed his fist into her arm, a sickening crack sounding out as her elbow snapped and her arm flopped loosely. Ruby punched forward with her other arm, but the Faunus caught her fist, lightning fast, and rotated her arm, forcing her to follow his movements as he flipped her over and snapped her arm back, dislocating her shoulder, and gave her a kick in the ribs. Ruby felt her bones shatter, her aura unable to block the direct force, and flew back, rolling and gasping. Both of her arms useless, she craned her neck and looked up, seeing Mark also being kicked at and tied down, his weapon confiscated. The sailors had all been captured by this point, being rounded up and bound together with chains, back to back. The White Fang didn't discriminate between the Faunus and humans, treating them equally and tying them together. There was a screaming sound as a bulky bear Faunus manhandled a struggling Jessica from her room. Jessica tried to use her training, landing a headbutt on the bear fauna's chin, but he merely gave a little grunt and smacked her in the head, knocking her unconscious. He threw her onto the ground, next to Ruby, and tied the two together by their throats. "Good job, boys," he said gruffly, standing back up. He pointed at a few of the pirates. "Go see if they need any help securing the cargo. The hoverjets need to pick the dust up and leave immediately." He turned back to the bound crew members and the 3 passengers. "So, good news or bad news first?" he asked mockingly. One of the crew members tried to spit at him, but instead got a kick in the side. He curled up, coughing. "All right then," the bear fauna said. "Good news is, we're also heading for the Dragon Wing, so you'll be getting to where you want to go." He paused for effect. "Bad news is, you're all hostages," he said, chuckling at his own joke. The pirates laughed uproariously. He clapped his hands, silencing them. "Take the hostages and store them in the passenger rooms," he instructed. "Put the engines to max speed, we're going to get there as fast as possible." Ruby felt herself being lifted up, feeling a little discomfort as her ribs shifted around and her arms flopped uselessly. Afanis placed her onto his shoulder, Jessica on his other shoulder, hauling them like a sack of potatoes. They were carried into one of the passenger rooms and thrown onto the bed. Another 2 sailors joined them, one of them a female cat faunus and the other one just a normal human female. The guard left the room and shut the door, locking it from the outside. Ignoring her injuries, Ruby used her legs and rolled herself up, looking around. Jessica was still unconscious, attached to her with a thick metal chain. The 2 other female sailors looked a little disoriented, the faunus sailor with blood dripping down her arm, the other one looking slightly concussed. Ruby walked over to the window and began kicking it, her sneakers slamming into it with loud thuds. The cat faunus looked up, shaking her head. "Those windows are reinforced glass," she said, "and all that's out there is the ocean." "The shoreline's only a few miles away," Ruby answered, continuing her kicking. "I think I can swim the distance and get help." Hairline fractures began to appear, and the fauna's eyes widened. And then the door opened and hands picked her up, throwing her onto the floor and away from the window. Ruby felt something in her back break. The pirate picked her up again by the chain around her neck, strangling her, as he shouting that future escape attempts would be severely punished. Ruby could only manage to nod, her vision fading, as he dumped her on the bed and wrapped her chain around the bedpost, securing it with a lock. Then he left the room and Ruby was left alone again, the 2 other women staring at her, frightened. Ruby lay there, taking a few deep breaths. Scooting back, she propped herself up against the wall. "Can one of you help me push my arm back in and set my other arm?" she asked. They looked at each other and both stood up, a collar connecting them, and walked over to Ruby. Don't that again, okay?" the human asked. "We can't let them get angry at us. I know you want to fight, but it's useless." "Brace yourself," the faunus female said. There was a popping sensation as Ruby's shoulder joint was put back in. "Thanks," Ruby said, rotating her shoulder. She propped herself up and grabbed the small table by the bed, picking it up with one arm and snapping the thin leg off of it along with a piece of the wood, resulting a chunk with a 90-degree angle. "Can you guys make me a splint with this? To set my elbow?" The faunus nodded, tearing up strips of the bedsheets and setting her elbow bones back together, placing her arm into the makeshift split and securing it to her shoulder. Ruby leaned back with a sigh of relief. "So, what are your names?" the human asked, speaking up. "We're going to be here for a while, so we should probably get to know each other." She brushed her hair back, rubbing her head. "I'll go first. I'm Cynthia." She pointed at Ruby. "You're Red, right? I've seen you on the ship a couple of times." Ruby nodded, looking at Cynthia. She had short pale blonde hair, almost white, cut to regulations, with light blue eyes and soft features. "I'm Diane," the cat faunus said. She had caramel skin and strong features, framed with short black hair. Her eyes were a shining yellow-green, her arms sinewy and muscled. "Nice to meet you," Ruby said. "Sort of, but not really." Diana almost smiled, while Cynthia still looked worried. Ruby pointed at Jessica, who was beginning to move a bit. "That's Jessica. What do you think they'll with us?" Cynthia asked, nervous. Diane frowned. "They put 4 pretty women in a room, What the hell do you think they want to do with us? Cynthia gulped, her imagination taking over for her. Red. Jessica asked, her eyes blinking. What happened? They beat us, Jessica, Ruby said. All of the crew members got captured and were put into the passenger rooms. Jessica slowly got up, looking around her and rubbing her head. Ow, she complained, that man punched me. Well, you were screaming a lot, Ruby said, grinning. Jessica gave her a tentative smile. That's Diane, and that's Cynthia. Diane nodded at her while Cynthia didn't look up, still lost in her thoughts. Ruby picked up the rest of the table and smashed it into pieces, picking up the sharp splinters of wood. I think we need a plan. Diane held her hand out and Ruby tossed her a few of the wooden stakes. We should fight back, Diane declared. We shouldn't, Cynthia mumbled. There's too many of them, we can't take them on all by ourselves. Cynthia is right, Jessica said slowly. We're just going to die if we attack them. So we just let them do whatever they want to us. Diane demanded, angry. I say we go out fighting. Cynthia looked at her. Maybe you'll live, since you're a faunus. Diane shook her head. No, they consider me as an enemy because I live with humans and work with humans. Cynthia sighed. Ruby nudged Jessica. So, what do you think? Wanna go out in a blaze of glory? I don't think that'll be a very bright blaze, Red, Jessica said, but I guess it's better than the alternative. You in, Cynthia? Diane asked, standing up and stretching. I can't really fight if you're still chained to me. Wait, I have an idea, Ruby said, ripping her t-shirt off. Diane raised an eyebrow. What, you're gonna distract them with your lady bits? Ruby laughed at that, stuffing the shirt into the space between the collar and her neck. Shaking her head, she pulled her chain up and threaded it between her collar and neck, the t-shirt on the other side. Holding the two sides of the chain in her fist, she began pulling, the thin metal collar groaning. The t-shirt protected her from the worst of the bruises as the collar pressed uncomfortably against her neck. With a snap, the metal stretched too far and broke apart. Ruby grasped the broken edges and bent the collar straight, taking it off of her neck. Whoa, Diane said, impressed. Do it for me. Ruby nodded and repeated the process for all of them, ending up with two long chains. Give me the two chains, Cynthia said, resigned. I think I can use them. Just like a whip, right? Ruby gave her the metal leashes. Cynthia stood up, stretching out her arms, and flicked the chains around her, the metal whistling through the air. I'm pretty sure we're all succumbing to mob mentality, Jessica said, but weirdly enough, I think I feel better now. Ruby grinned, baring her sharp teeth. You'd have made a great warrior. Moving to the bed, Ruby carefully broke it into pieces, slamming her hand down at each joint and taking it apart. She handed Jessica the resulting pieces of jagged wood. Taking positions and surrounding the door, they waited for the pirates to come.